Clint Eastwood wasn't looking for attention. He wasn't giving autographs or posing for pictures. He was just another face in the crowd, until he wasn't. When he stopped at a tiny sidewalk art stand, something shifted. The rush of the city carried on, but at that moment, everything changed. Because the girl behind that stand, Sophie Carter, wasn't just selling paintings. She was fighting for her life. And in true Clint Eastwood fashion, he didn't just buy a painting. He did something no one could have expected. Something that would alter her future forever. What happened next wasn't just an act of generosity. It became a moment of legend. The hospital room was cold, not just from the air conditioning, but from the weight of the words about to be spoken. Fluorescent lights buzzed softly, their sterile glow making everything feel even more lifeless. Sophie sat on the crinkled paper of the hospital bed, hands clenched in her lap. Across from her, Dr. Patel adjusted his glasses, his voice measured, practiced. She knew that tone. The tone doctors use when they're about to say something that will make the world tilt. "The treatment is working," he said, a glimmer of optimism in his voice. But then came the pause, the hesitation. "You'll need at least 2 more rounds of chemo." Sophie barely reacted. The pain, the nausea, the exhaustion, it was all routine now. But then came the real blow. The out-of-pocket costs, without insurance coverage, it'll be. Another pause. A sigh. Substantial. Beside her, Sophie's mother gripped the armrest of her chair so tightly her knuckles turned white. Sophie didn't need to look at her to know. She was holding back tears. Their savings were already gone. The last round had pushed them to the edge. And now, they were staring into the abyss. The drive home was silent. Her father's voice, hoarse with forced reassurance, echoed in her mind. "We'll find a way." But Sophie heard the lie beneath it. That night, as she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, a thought cut through the fear. She couldn't change the diagnosis. She couldn't make the medical bills disappear. But she could fight back. And she would. Art had always been her escape, a way to turn chaos into color. But now, it had to be more than that. It had to be survival. By morning, her decision was made. She wasn't going to wait for a miracle. She was going to make one. The first stroke of paint always felt like magic. The brush skimmed across the canvas, blues melting into oranges, a world unfolding beneath her fingertips. This wasn't just a painting. It was hope in a frame. Days later, her tiny art stand stood on a busy downtown sidewalk, a wooden table covered in neatly arranged canvases, each one a piece of her soul. A simple, handwritten sign stood in front. "Original art, funding my cancer treatment." Her mother had helped her set up, but from here, Sophie was on her own. People passed by. Some glanced. Most didn't. She tried not to let it bother her. She told herself that all she needed was one person, one sale. Just enough to keep going. Hope was a fragile thing, but she clung to it anyway. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher. Sweat beaded at her temple. A woman in a navy blazer slowed, admiring a canvas. Sophie's heart pounded. Maybe this was it. Maybe. The woman shook her head and walked away. A man in sunglasses and a tailored suit stopped just long enough to read the sign. His mouth pressed into a thin line. Then he turned and left. The rejection stung more than she expected. She tightened her grip on the table's edge, steadying herself against the dizziness creeping in. Then, finally, a change. An elderly couple approached, the woman's fingers lightly tracing the edge of a canvas. "This is beautiful," she murmured. Sophie swallowed hard. $80. A pause. A glance between them. "We'll take it." For a second, Sophie didn't move. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind 100 times, but now that it was real, she felt frozen. Then, as she took the money and carefully packed the painting, something cracked open inside her. Her first sale. Her first victory. Maybe she was just one girl selling art on a street corner. But she wasn't done yet. The next day was just like the last. Hours of waiting. More glances. More rejection. And then, someone different. She was young, maybe in her late 20s. A press badge clipped to her bag. "This is beautiful," she said, motioning toward a twilight cityscape. "Did you paint all of these yourself?" Sophie blinked. "Yeah," a small smile. A phone pulled from her pocket. "I run an online arts blog. Mind if I take a few photos?" Sophie hesitated. "Wait, really? Really?" For the next few minutes, the woman snapped pictures of the paintings, of Sophie, of the small, handwritten sign that told the world why she was there. Then she asked the question Sophie wasn't expecting. "What's your story?" So she told her. The diagnosis, the mounting bills, the desperate attempt to fight back. The journalist nodded, scribbling notes. "People should hear this," she said. "I'll make sure they do." Sophie didn't think much of it. People made promises all the time. But the next morning, when she arrived at her stand, everything was different. More people were stopping, not just to look, but to buy. Then her phone buzzed. A message from her best friend. "Dude, check this out." She clicked the link. Her stomach flipped. An article. Fighting for art. Fighting for life. The teen painting her way to chemo. At the bottom, thousands of shares. Her hands trembled. This was real. But even then, she had no idea just how big this was about to become. Because her biggest customer yet? He was already on his way. The city moved in a blur around her. Cars honked. Tourists snapped pictures. Businessmen rushed past, eyes glued to their phones. Sophie adjusted a stack of paintings, trying to ignore the exhaustion pressing down on her bones. Then everything shifted. A presence. A stillness. Like the air itself had changed. A man stood at her stand. Tall, weathered leather jacket. Cowboy hat tilted just enough to cast a shadow over his face. He wasn't like the others. He wasn't checking his phone. He wasn't rushing to his next meeting. He was looking. Really looking. Sophie barely paid him any mind until he spoke. "See anything you like?" she asked, her voice hoarse from the long day. A smirk. Subtle. Barely there. But unmistakable. "Depends," he said, voice gravelly and slow. "What's the story behind these?" She hesitated. Most people asked about the price, not the story. But something about him made her answer. So she told him. And when she finished, he nodded. No pity. No sympathy. Just a nod. Then he reached for a painting. And in that moment, Sophie's life changed forever. He lifted the canvas from the table, tilting it slightly in the light. A vast desert landscape. A lone cowboy in the distance. Stark black and white. Light clashing against shadow. Endless sky stretching beyond the horizon. Sophie held her breath. It was one of her favorites. She had spent weeks perfecting it. "I'll take this one," the man said. She barely reacted. Customers had picked pieces before, handed over cash, walked away. $200, she said, forcing the words out. But he didn't reach for his wallet. Instead, he pulled something from his pocket, a checkbook. Sophie blinked. Who even carried checkbooks anymore? She watched as he uncapped a pen, his movements slow, deliberate. The scratch of ink against paper filled the silence. Then, with a quiet rip, he tore the check free and handed it to her. She took it, fingers barely gripping the paper, her pulse hammering in her ears. And then she saw the number. Not $200, not $2,000, $50,000. Her breath hitched. The city noise faded into a dull hum. The world around her blurred, her vision narrowing to a single, impossible reality. This wasn't right. This wasn't real. This, she whispered, barely able to form the words. This must be a mistake. The man smirked, tipping his hat back slightly, revealing his face fully for the first time. And Sophie's heart stopped. Clint Eastwood, her father's favorite actor, the man whose movies had played in her living room every weekend. The Hollywood icon who didn't just play tough guys on screen. He was one in real life. And now he was standing in front of her, handing her a check that could change everything. She looked up at him, mouth open, words failing her. "No mistake, kid," Clint said, his voice low, steady. "You just keep painting." At first, no one noticed. The city carried on, fast and distracted, unaware that history had just been made on a quiet sidewalk. Then a whisper. A teenage boy, earbuds jammed in, slowed mid-step, staring at Clint, his head tilted, his eyes widened. "Wait, is that Clint Eastwood?" A woman nearby turned, phone half raised. Her gaze flicked from the painting to the man in the cowboy hat. Then a second whisper, a third, and then it happened. A flurry of movement, people stopping in their tracks, conversations halting mid-sentence. Someone gasped, another snapped a photo. And just like that, the quiet afternoon became a frenzy. "Oh my God, it's really him. Why is he buying a painting? What's going on?" Phones shot up in every direction. A group of college students rushed closer, their voices filled with disbelief. A businesswoman in high heels nearly tripped as she turned back. And then the tipping point. A man in a suit, who had walked past Sophie's stand earlier without a second glance, turned back. "What's happening?" he asked, stepping forward. His eyes darted between Clint and Sophie, then to the check clutched in her trembling hands. He saw the number. His jaw dropped. "Wait, he just bought a painting for $50,000. A woman gasped. And then, the moment everything changed, a voice from the crowd. "I'll take this one." A man in a blue polo shirt grabbed a cityscape painting, pulling out his wallet without hesitation. Before Sophie could even process what was happening, another voice. "And this one? How much is this?" Within minutes, the paintings that had been ignored for days were being snatched up, one by one. People weren't just buying, they were scrambling. No one haggled. No one hesitated. A teenage girl turned to her mom, eyes wide. "I need cash. Now." Sophie sat there, stunned, watching as her once quiet booth transformed into the hottest attraction in the city. And Clint just stood there, calm as ever, hands in his pockets, watching it all unfold. Finally, he leaned in slightly and muttered just loud enough for Sophie to hear. "Told you, kid. Just keep painting." Then, with the tip of his hat, he turned and walked away, leaving Sophie in the middle of a moment she never could have imagined. And the craziest part? This was only the beginning. By the time Sophie got home that night, her phone was on fire. Ping, ping, ping. Notifications flooded her screen. Messages, alerts, hundreds, no, thousands of them. At first, she thought something was wrong. Then she saw the headlines. "Clint Eastwood buys teens painting for $50,000, and you won't believe why." Hollywood legend stuns young artist battling cancer in the most unbelievable way. Her face was everywhere. A single photo, Clint Eastwood standing at her tiny booth, holding the black and white cowboy painting, was plastered across news sites, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. A video someone had taken of the moment he handed her the check. Over 3 million views. Her best friend, Lucas, called first. "Sophie, you are literally everywhere." She barely heard him. Her hands were shaking too hard as she scrolled. Then came the messages, not just from strangers, from buyers, from all over the country, all over the world. "Hi, Sophie. I'd love to buy a piece of your work. Do you ship to Texas? Your story inspired me so much. I'd like to commission a painting, any price, just name it. My daughter is also fighting cancer. Your strength gives us hope. I'd love to buy something to support you." Dozens of messages turned into hundreds, then thousands. Orders, donations, requests for interviews. Then, the email that stopped her cold. Subject, gallery inquiry. She clicked it with trembling fingers. A prestigious gallery owner in New York had seen her story. "Sophie, your work is remarkable. We'd love to showcase your paintings in our upcoming exhibition. Let's talk." Her heart pounded against her ribs. This was real. She wasn't just selling paintings anymore. She had become something bigger, a symbol of resilience. And just like that, her life was no longer about survival. It was about what came next. 1 month later, Sophie walked into the hospital for her final round of chemo, paid in full. Every bill, every debt, every crushing financial burden that had once loomed over her family gone. Because of one painting, because of one moment, because a man in a cowboy had stopped, listened, and believed in her. The treatment was rough. The nausea, the exhaustion, it still took its toll. But this time, she wasn't scared. Because outside of that hospital room, a future was waiting for her. A week after her final treatment, a letter arrived. Handwritten. She opened it carefully, her fingers shaking. "Sophie, your fight reminds me why some stories still matter. Never stop telling yours. Clint." Tears welled in her eyes. She folded the letter carefully, pressing it to her chest. Then, later that night, she picked up a brush. Because this wasn't the end of her story. It was just the beginning. 1 month later, Sophie's first official gallery show opened. A year later, her art was featured in international exhibits. Her inbox never stopped filling with commission requests. Her career had just begun, but there was one painting she would never sell. The first one she had ever sold. The black and white Western landscape. It now hung in Clint Eastwood's private collection. A reminder that true grit, it isn't just in the movies. Sometimes it walks among us. And sometimes, all it takes is one moment, one act of belief, to change a life forever. Life has a way of testing us in ways we never expect. Sometimes the greatest battles aren't fought on grand stages, but in quiet, unseen struggles, like a young woman painting on a street corner, hoping the world will notice. Sophie Carter's story isn't just about art or luck. It's about resilience, about the power of refusing to surrender even when the odds are stacked against you. We often hear that success is about hard work, talent, or even connections. But sometimes it's about one moment, the right person crossing your path at the right time. A moment that changes everything. But here's the truth. Those moments don't happen by chance. They happen because someone keeps showing up, keeps fighting, keeps putting themselves out there even when no one seems to care. Clint Eastwood didn't just buy a painting. He saw something in Sophie. Her courage, her defiance against fate, and his belief ignited something larger than either of them. It's a reminder that a single act of support, a single moment of recognition, can alter the course of a life. For those of us navigating our own struggles, Sophie's story is proof that persistence matters, that the road will be long and rejection will be plenty, but all it takes is one breakthrough. And for those in positions to give, to uplift, to acknowledge, never underestimate the power of what that means. Because sometimes believing in someone at the right time isn't just kindness, it's life-changing.